Hi everyone! For Chapter 4, we will be discussing the next level in the hierarchy of structural organization, the tissues level. We already went through the first two levels at the chemical and cell levels in the last two chapters. So now we will talk about how can those cells connect with each other and what different types of tissues arise from those cells. Now bear in mind that this is one of I would say the longest chapter of the entire semester, and usually for my 2-hour 40-minute classes I actually need the entire time. So for in class this was a face-to-face lecture, I usually need to cut into the lab time. So but this is the only lecture or chapter that will need and require that much time just because it's a long chapter. So bear with me. I will separate this chapter into parts of 1 hour. So at 1 hour I'll give you a break and then it will go into part 2. All right. So let's get started. Okay, remember we mentioned that cells work together to form tissues and that the study of tissues is called histology. There are 4 basic types of tissues we will talk about in this chapter. First type is called epithelial tissue. Okay, which are cells that cover and protect exposed surfaces, line internal passages or hollow spaces, and some of them even releases specific types of secretions. For example, for lubrication purposes, as we have mentioned with the serous membrane in the very first chapter. So I would say a key term for epithelial tissue is covering. Okay, covers. So any covering of any sort, surfaces, covering of external or internal areas, that's a type of epithelial tissue most likely. Second type of tissue is called connective tissues. Okay, so that's a second and called connective tissue, and this is the most diverse group of tissues we have, and hence is the longest section of the chapter, which is another reason why this chapter is so long, because we have to talk about every single one of those specific kind of tissue within the connective tissue category. They serve usually as purpose of filling internal spaces, kind of like I like to describe them as styrofoam nuggets in a shipment package. If you've ever received online orders in your mail, you see all those bubble wraps, those little styrofoam nuggets, those kind of like the package material that stabilizes your important product. So in our body, we have our important organs. So these connective tissue is kind of like serving as those package material to stabilize our important organs and other tissues. Okay, so other than packaging and filling the internal spaces, it serves to provide structural support and even other functions like storing energy. So that's why this is the most diverse group of tissues, is because some of them are structural, some of them are package, some of them are even just for distributing nutrients. So we'll talk about all those different types of connective tissue. All right. And then the third type of tissue is called the muscle tissue, which is very straightforward. There are 3 different types of muscles in our body, and of course, it functions to help with movement. And then the last type of tissue, the simplest of the 4, is the nervous tissue. And their main job is to carry electrical signals. Okay, not crossing it out, but circling it, is to carry sensory and motor information in form of electrical signals. Even though in this chapter, in terms of the types of cells they have, is not very complex, it is one of the most complex chapter when we do get to the nervous tissue and explaining how does an electrical signal go from one end of the neuron to the other end of the neuron. There's a whole long process and pretty complicated that we will go over when we get to chapter 12, and also mention it in chapter 10 in talking about how nervous tissue activates muscular tissue. So be looking forward to those things. So all four of these tissues will combine in different ways to make different organs and organ system. Okay? So let's start by talking about the epithelial tissue, the very first type of tissue we have in the body. The epithelial tissue contains, of course, the epithelia layer, which are cells that cover your external, like your skin, for example, or internal surfaces, like the interior wall of your airway, your stomach, your intestine, etc. Now, the epithelial layer may associate with glands that produces secretions that are either attached or derived from the epithelia itself. So we'll talk about those accessory glands as well when we get to towards the end of the epithelial tissue portion. Okay. So the epithelial tissue has four main functions. One, of course, is to provide that physical protection that I said is important. Physical protection. Again, especially against things like, rubbing, abrasions. So this is, for example, in areas that is more consistent, that is, consistently prone or exposed to rubbing, or things are passing by all the time, all day long, there will be several layers of these epithelial tissues as protection so they won't change or damage the connective tissue or the muscular tissue or other features that's underneath your epithelial tissue. Remember that the epithelial tissue serves as a surface, okay, whether it aligns exterior or interior things. If things are constantly rubbing against it, cells will be torn off, okay? So that this is why we need to have that epithelial layer to protect those tissues underneath, okay? Now, they also protect against dehydration. So that's why we have dehydration listed here. This is why we have glands in the epithelial tissue that secrete mucus. This is to, in case that we have, we're not walking around. Like I usually say, we're not walking around like a little slime man. We're dry on our surface, and the ability of our cells to have mucous membrane in some areas is what keeps us hydrated. Now, for the skin, we have special features that we'll talk about, such as keratinization, that prevents our cells from drying out. Or it needs to dry up before it becomes keratinized for surfaces of our skin. But if you think about interior surfaces like the lining of your esophagus, lining of your airway, trachea, lining of your stomach, all those are kind of mucousy, slimy, and that's all for the purpose of keeping your body, those surfaces hydrated, so that when things are constantly rubbing against it, food is moving past by your esophagus, they're not having a hard time passing by those tissues or squeezing those food down because it's too dry. So that's why you need those mucous membranes there. We'll talk about mucous membranes and mucous glands. We'll talk about those in a bit. Now, the epithelial tissues also protects us against chemicals or biological agents. Okay, we'll talk about how our skin is the first line of defense against microorganisms. So pathogens that try to come into our body, they need to get by our skin first, unless they come through our mouth or our eyes or other openings of our body. But other than that, our skin is doing a lot of protection for us against pathogens. Second, they can help with controlling permeability of that particular organ. For example, when we talk about the urinary system, there's a lot of different types of permeability within different areas of what's called the nephron in the kidney. Some areas are only permeable to water, and some areas are only permeable to sodium chloride or salts. And it is because of this differences in permeability that enables the kidney to filter our blood, absorbing what's necessary and secreting what's unnecessary or even harmful, or concentrate our urine to manage our body water content. Okay, so either we're absorbing what's beneficial or we are releasing what's harmful to our body, or we are concentrating our urine down so that we make sure we don't lose too much water if our body is in need of water at the moment. Okay, all of these things we'll talk about in AMP2 for the urinary system, but the ability of the urinary system within the kidney that they can do that is because they have that selectively permeable membrane as designed by the epithelial tissues of the nephrons within the kidney. So every organ we will be talking about, we will mention what type of epithelia it has and why they have those epithelia. A lot of times there's a function and a reason why that area of the body have this type of epithelia. And we'll talk about the different types of epithelia in a moment. So in addition, our body can control permeability of epithelial tissues with hormones. Okay, so these are some stimuli. A lot of times those are in forms of hormones. If we go back to the kidney as our example, there are specific hormones called ADH, antidiuretic hormone, if you have heard of that hormone before. It is what tells your nephrons to either conserve more water or excrete more water in urine. So again, going back to what I talked about previously in chapter 1, that our body needs hormones as means of communication to achieve homeostasis. So we'll go talk about all those things in detail in the second semester. And like I said, a little bit about calcium ion regulation in the blood with our skeletal system in this semester, but most of the homeostasis stuff will come in the second semester. Now, some epithelial tissue will provide sensations, okay? The ability for us to feel different degrees of temperature, for example, pressure, pain, etc. We'll talk about some of this in the integumentary system when we get to chapter 5. Lastly, some epithelial tissue will produce unique secretions like I was talking about with their gland cells to protect surfaces, like, for example, cerebrospinal fluid we'll talk about when we get to the brain chapter, that protects the brain and the spinal cord against mechanical shock, etc. Just because you're hit in the head with a ball, it doesn't give you a coma every time you're hit in the head with a ball, because there's that cerebrospinal fluid in addition to your skull protecting your brain. There will be mucus along large intestine, for example. That's another type of unique secretion, is because as your feces is moving along your intestine, it's also getting dehydrated as well. That's the main job of your large intestine, is to reabsorb as much water as possible from the food that you ingest. So as your feces is drying up, it'll get tougher and tougher to move along those the intestinal lining, and that's why the large intestine compared to the small intestine have a lot of mucous membrane. Okay, mucus glands. We'll talk about that in AMP2 again, and kind of see it through this chapter as well. Some epithelial tissue can regulate temperature, like sweating on our skin. That's part of able to cool our body down, as we've mentioned in chapter 1, or as means of communication through interstitial fluid or blood. So those secretion can do a multiple number of things for us in the body. Okay, so even though there can be different types of epithelial tissues covering different organs or parts of the body, they do share some general characteristics, and these are what we're going to be talking about here. For sure, first, they have what's called polarity. Polarity meaning that what's on top or the exposed surface of the cell is structurally different from the bottom or attached surface of the cell. The superior portion and the inferior portion of the epithelial cells is not necessarily symmetrical. Okay, and a lot of times they are not symmetrical because one is exposed to the outside surface or your hollow space within your stomach or hollow space within your intestines, while the bottom part of the cell is attached to the connective tissue that's underneath or the muscular layer tissue that's underneath. Okay. So that's why there is always polarity with epithelial cells. The exposed surface is referred to as the apical surface, while the attached surface is referred to as the basal surface. So the easy way to remember basal versus apical, basal sounds like base, okay? So that must be the bottom, okay, of the cell, and then apical starts with an A, okay? A comes before B, so A is on top first before you get to the basal surface. And a lot of times that's a good anatomy word to remember because we will refer to apical surface of something or apical region of an organ, which means the top portion of that organ. As I've talked about in the cell chapter, the apical surface of these cells often have either microvilli or cilia. Okay, remember the difference between these two. Microvilli is for absorption or secretion purposes. They're smaller and looks like that, tinier and probably more dense a lot of times. Cilia is for movement of fluid around the cell. So either you're moving mucus along or you're moving an egg cell along, etc. You're moving something along. All right. So the basal surface of the cell is attached to what's called the basement membrane. Okay, so this is the basement membrane right here, this layer, this gray area right there. So this is a thin non-cellular layer, and it is, it is serving as means of connection to the next layer below and resisting overstretching of the cell, because these epithelial cells a lot of times is serving as a purpose of protection or maintaining fluid within a hollow organ. So you can't have these cells falling apart whenever they want. And that's why this basement membrane is kind of serving like a little layer of glue that makes sure all the cells stays together. Okay. Epithelial cells usually don't have blood vessel, or what we call avascular. Okay, avascular means A without vascular vessels. Okay, so that's why they lack blood vessels. Hence, in order for epithelial cells to receive nutrients for oxygen, nutrients or oxygen was what I mean. Everything has to happen through the diffusion process. Okay, there's no duct there's no blood vessels that deliver certain things to epithelial cells specifically. A lot of times things need to travel into the plasma membrane via diffusion or specific channel proteins and carrier proteins we talked about in the last chapter. And lastly, most epithelial cells have the capacity to regenerate, which means, the ability to cell divide. Okay, we mentioned that one of its main function for epithelial cell is to protect against abrasion. Now, that doesn't mean they're like cells of steel, like metal sheets. They are prone to damage. Okay, they do tear and fall off, but they have the capacity to regenerate. And so areas like the skin or the esophagus, where it is constantly exposed to things rubbing against its surface, will have many layers of cells to replenish. And that's what you will see when we talk about the integumentary system in the next chapter, for chapter 5. In addition to those general characteristics, individual epithelial cells may have additional features that enable them to move fluids over surfaces through epithelium and produce secretion. So these are the specializations. I've already mentioned them before. So again, as I've mentioned, microvilli is what's usually abundant in areas where there's a lot of absorption or secretions involved. And those curvatures, you see these microvilli here, these curvatures right here can actually provide 20 times more surface area to the cell compared to if it was completely flat. Okay, so curvature versus flat makes a big difference. Now imagine if you take a piece of flat sheet of paper and you crumble it into a ball. This is what I usually will demonstrate in class if this was a face-to-face lecture. Well, all that surface area, you can feel free to do it on your own if you want, but you can imagine, crumble a piece of paper. Now, all that surface area of that entire sheet of paper is now hidden in that ball of paper. Okay, so it not only conserves space, but it also is able to provide all that surface area to allow for exchange of important materials like nutrients and gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that piece of paper is just like microvilli. So in a sense, you have tons of little crumbled pieces of paper all over that top of the cell to provide the cell with extra surface area. Now, the other special feature we talked about being on the apical side of the cell is cilia. Okay? And when an epithelium has cilia on it, sometimes we call it a ciliated type of epithelium. And one cell can actually have about 250 cilia that beats in one direction. Okay, note the one direction. Let me erase that curvature so I don't end up covering up stuff. Okay. All right. So note that something important for cilia beating is that it must be coordinated and also always in one direction. Okay, imagine a little swishy wipe. Okay, the swishy wipe in a bus is not serving the purpose of moving things in one direction. So if you're trying to move things in one direction, if the cilia is just swishing however they want, whenever they want, asynchronously sometimes, then your whatever you're trying to push is not going to get anywhere. The cilia has to beat in that one direction, so they will be able to sweep something in that one direction. So here's a good video, a short clip that will show you how cilia works and why pushing or sort of moving in that one direction is important in moving. For example, a piece of this gunk right here. You'll see this piece of gunk right here move from the bottom of here of the cell to the top of that organ or tissue with these ciliated epithelium. So here's that gunk. You see how it moved from that location, slowly moving upwards towards this area. Okay, and ends up being here. So that's how cilia is able to work. If it's swish swaps, back and forth, that piece of gunk is going to stay there. But because they're all moving, sweeping in that one direction, it's going to move that piece of gunk in the direction we want it to be. And if this was the airway, for instance, then it would be towards our oral cavity, so we can spit that piece of mucus out. And that piece of mucus can contain pathogens or dust particles, pollen particles, etc. So that's why we have to blow our nose, we have to hack off some mucus from our throat, etc. In different times of the day, is because to get rid of those things from our important airways. Now, interestingly, the cilia that lines our airways can be damaged by nicotine and carbon monoxide, in cigarette smoke. So this is why they say, people that chronically smoke. Now, I'm not saying that you smoke one or two cigarettes and then there goes your cilia. This is a gradual process. And so if someone has been smoking for years, a lot of their cilia will become damaged, and what they've seen on epithelial cells between comparing epithelial cells of a non-smoker compared to a smoker, they see a lot less number of cilia. And that's why a lot of times you will see chronic smokers needing to cough a lot, and they have a much harder time to cough up their mucus. Okay? It's because technically speaking, the cilia is supposed to do some of the work for you in moving mucus away from your airways. But if you don't have them, then you have to rely on that burst of air coming out from your lungs to move the cilia along. But how do these epithelial cells connect with each other so that, for example, your red blood cells won't try to seep through between two adjacent epithelial cells that line your blood vessels, for example? Or if a scarier situation, in a scarier situation, is how can epithelial cells of the stomach lining ensure that the stomach acid, which has pH of 1, as we have learned in the chemistry chapter, make sure that those stomach acid won't leak through between the cells of your stomach so we don't burn other tissue layers of the stomach or even other organs nearby. Okay, there's no other organ in our body that can withstand such a low pH of liquid. So it is very critical that we contain liquid like that. So there are specialized intercellular connections called cell junctions that exist between epithelial cells that are adjacent to each other. There are two main types to mention. One is called gap junctions, and which contains channels that allow small molecules and ions to pass between cells. So it's kind of named after, the name itself speaks for what it does. They contain gaps. So gaps like this, okay? Gaps like this that can allow stuff to go through between the cells from one cell to another. Now, for example, we just gone through the cilia movement that have to be coordinated, so they can't be waving around whenever they want. And in that coordinated manner, how are they able to coordinate? Is they are able to pass ions from one cell to the next in signaling the next cell when to beat in that particular manner. Same with heart muscle cells, okay? They know when to beat in a coordinated manner due to existence of these gap junctions that allow little messages in form of ions to pass from one cardiac muscle cell to another. So that's why gap junctions are very critical for function purposes as well of those cells. Now, these channels, these holes you're seeing here, are created with a protein called connexin. Okay, connexin sounds like connecting. Okay, so if you see something sounds like connecting, connexin, that means it joins two cells together by forming some sort of cylinder with a central opening, kind of like a long donut. Okay, that allows things to move through just like this, okay, between two cells. For example, this is an epithelial cell and this is another epithelial cells, and there's that gap junctions that allow things to move through. A second type of cell junction is called tight junctions, which binds two cells with interlocking membrane proteins, kind of like staples. Okay, I won't require you to know the name of these proteins. Okay, there's a lot of information, and I know it will be information overload already. So I try to stick with what's important for that chapter. So this type of tight junction is supported with, in addition, what's called adhesion belts that further reinforce the connection between the two cells. This is how we can prevent fluids from leaking out of tissues and organs using these tight seals between epithelial cells. So if you look, zoom into this area right here between two cells, here's those staples like tight junctions I was talking about, and that adhesion belt that further supports the connection between the two cells. So other than the basement membrane here serving as glue to keep the cells together, you have these staples all along between two cells to make sure they're, sticking pretty close together so you don't have things leaking out or things falling apart, tissues falling apart when you don't want them to. So on the basal side of the epithelial cells, we have already mentioned the existence of a basement membrane, like I was saying. Okay, so we have the basement membrane itself is what keeps the cells together and makes sure that the epithelial layer is firmly attached to the rest of the body. So epithelial cells don't have blood vessels, so they need the support of the other layer of cells and tissues like connective tissue, muscular tissues to keep them alive. Okay, especially connective tissue, because a lot of the blood vessels resides within the connective tissue layer. And And once an epithelial cell detach from other cell, they will die, just like how dead skin cells are able to fall off. And that's why it doesn't hurt when we, sort of lose some of our skin cells by rubbing on the table right now in front of you. It's because they are technically dead cells. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter 5. Okay. So again, if we want to review, tight gap junction is what allows ions to go through, allows chemicals to go through. Okay, tight junction is what keeps fluids from leaking out of tissues and organs using those staples and adhesion belt that keep fluids from, keep fluids contained. Okay, and then you have that attachment to the basement membrane. Now, the basement membrane is made up of 2 layers, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. So here's the basal lamina being this layer right here, and the reticular lamina being the bottom inferior layer or deep layer of the basement membrane. The basal lamina is just a layer that's close to the epithelial cell that functions as a filter of some sort to prevent large molecules from escaping into the next layer of tissues like proteins or red blood cells, whatever it is that tries to go through. It will prevent it from going through. Reticular lamina, on the other layer, contains fibers that give the membrane strength and some flexibility. Okay, so it's for strength and flexibility. Okay, strength and flexibility. And basal lamina is the main filter that prevents big molecules, important molecules, for example, amino acids, glucose, all that good stuff, from trying to get across and stay contained. So how are epithelial cells classified by name? This is the one type of tissue where we do have a systematic way to classify them by the cell shapes, okay, and the number of cell layers it has. So it is pretty, straightforward in remembering how to name epithelial cells specifically. So for cell shapes, there are 3 types, okay? So you have your squamous cells, okay? Now, all of these here, different views of the 3 types of cell shape. We're talking about a sectional view where we're cutting across the epithelial cells or the organ to see and look at how they look like, okay? So for squamous, they tend to appear more thin and flat, and they look a little bit like scales. So sometimes they look like this, sometimes you will see something like this, okay? So when they're in many layers, sometimes they will look like tons of scales all attached and stacked on top of each other like that. Cuboidal is a second type of cell shape, and it kind of shapes like the way it sounds, like little cubes or boxes like this, okay? And then you have columnar, which shapes again like the way it sounds as well, like columns where you have tall, slender rectangles as a cell, okay? So columnar cells, cuboidal cells, and squamous cells. And you can see, how you name that piece of tissue by how they shape like. Now, for number of cell layers is either you have 1 layer or many layers. Very simple. 2 ways to name them. Epithelial tissue that is made up of only 1 cell layer is called simple epithelium, while those that is made up of 2 or more layer is called stratified epithelium. So because simple epithelium is made up of only 1 cell layer, they're usually very thin and usually function to line internal compartments or passageways where a lot of things need to go through and diffuse through. Okay, for example, those serous membrane we learned about in chapter 1, and also those that line the respiratory passageway, your respiratory air sacs like your alveoli, they're usually very thin because they need that efficient gas exchange between your lungs and the blood vessels. So that's why those would usually have simple epithelium. Okay. And because serous membrane like pleura, pericardium, and peritoneum, all of those are for reducing friction. So you can have a really thick piece of rubber between tissues that defeats the purpose of lubrication. So that's why those tend to be very thin in a simple one cell layer. Stratified epithelium, on the other hand, can be made up of several cell layers, so they're usually functioning as a mechanical or chemical protection of some sort for the cells. For example, the surface of our skin, we will learn in the next chapter that the most outer surface of our skin, the layer called epidermis, is actually made up of tens of layers of cells, so that every time we accidentally scratch ourselves on our skin or rub against something, we're not cutting down to the necessarily down to the connective tissue layer. We'll just probably have removed our epidermal tissues. So stratified epithelium is for that mechanical and chemical protection. Okay, simple epithelium for lubrication, okay, or for areas where there needs to be fast exchange between two areas of the organ. So to complete the nomenclature of epithelial tissue, we just need to combine cell shape and cell layer together. So let's go over the different types of epithelial tissue we can have in the body. We will start with simple squamous epithelium. Simple means one layer. Okay, and squamous, we just said, means they are flat and scale-like shaped epithelium. So out of all different types of epithelium, this is the most delicate one, and because they have only one layer, and since they are thin, it is very efficient, like I was talking about, for allowing diffusion or absorption of materials where things need to get across a membrane very quickly. Okay, now this is not talking about intestines. We're talking about, for example, surfaces of your lungs, alveoli, where we're constantly doing gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they're exchanged all the time at a rapid rate. Our cells are always in need of oxygen, and they're always producing the byproduct of carbon dioxide that we need to get rid of. So that's why those areas will have this simple squamous epithelium. Or, like I was talking about, this type of epithelial tissue can be used as a surface to reduce friction. For example, like those of serous membranes. Okay, linings, okay, serous membranes that lines your body cavities, such as your lungs or your heart, okay, lungs or your heart or your abdominal cavity. So blood vessels, okay, are also lined with simple squamous epithelium for easy diffusion of nutrients and gases. Okay, so three areas. Okay, one is where we need quick exchange of diffusion, okay, by diffusion. Second is where we need to reduce friction, like the body cavities that lines those that lines your body cavities, those that line your lungs, your heart. And then thirdly, those that need quick exchange in your blood vessels. That's another area where we have simple squamous epithelium. Okay, a general term for epithelial tissues that line body cavities is called mesothelium. Remember those pleura, pericardium, peritoneum we talked about in the chapter 1. They're generally referred as the mesothelium, while those that line the inner surface of blood vessels or the heart are called endothelium. Remember what I talked about in terms of prefixes and to remember. So endo, okay, means inner. So if you see endo as a prefix, it means it's lining or something that's on the inside or something that lines the inner layer of the organ or tissue. So for the lab on classification of tissues, you will have to be able to identify different types and kinds of tissue by histology pictures and what organs they are from. So for example, the type of tissue for all of these three pictures here is epithelial tissue. Okay, so this here refers to as the type of tissue. So make sure you pay attention on lecture exam or lab practical purposes, whether I'm asking for the type of tissue or specific kind of tissue. Okay, so type of tissue is epithelial tissue, and the specific kind of tissue we're talking about here is simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so all of these three are from different parts of the body. So here in this case, we have alveoli of the lungs that I keep mentioning, and this is that simple squamous layer between those alveoli. If you look at models of the alveoli, you'll see that your lungs are filled with these little balloon-like structures, and they're kind of like this, okay? They tend to look like little grapes, okay? You have these grape-like structures within the lungs, okay? So these are your alveoli. And when you take a cross section, slice it through, that's what we see is those curvatures of where every one of those little curvatures or spheres you're seeing on those balloons. So every one of those simple squamous epithelium is for diffusion of gases between the capillaries that surround your lungs and your lungs, okay? It's for oxygen exchange, okay? Oxygen and carbon dioxide movement. So this second picture here is looking at an example of the mesothelium, specifically the peritoneum, those that line your abdominal cavity, and you can see this layer right here, and it kind of even extends out and kind of goes off, okay? So that is a mesothelium layer, and this is just part of that internal organ in your abdomen. Okay, and that layer here is the peritoneum, or what we call the serous membrane. Okay, that makes sure our abdominal organs are not rubbing against each other and there's lubrication. And then lastly, you have your blood vessel. And this right here is that simple squamous epithelium. I was talking about, we see how there's a cell here, a cell there, and a cell there. They're usually, you can tell that there are cells by that purple dot because that's the nuclei of the epithelial tissues. Okay, so that's why you see these dots here, because there's those multiple nuclei of the different types of cells that forms that layer. Okay, so make sure you know specific type of tissue, epithelial tissue. Specific kind of tissue is simple squamous epithelium. This is from lungs, alveoli of the lungs. This is from peritoneum of your abdominal cavity. This is a blood vessel within your circulatory system. Okay? Be able to identify these by pictures in case I do end up asking them on exams or lab practical. You will have another set of pictures in lab exercise. Okay, so the next kind of specific epithelial tissue we will classify is stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified here means that there are two or more epithelial layers of epithelial cells that make up this epithelium. And in areas where it is more prone to a lot of mechanical stress, there will be multiple layers of cells. So here are some examples where there will be stratified squamous epithelium. For example, surfaces of your skin, like I've talked about, lining of your mouth, esophagus, anus. Those are areas of the body where things are moving past those tissues consistently. So this is a particular example on the surface of the tongue, and you will see your squamous, stratified squamous epithelium up here. There will be more obvious pictures in a bit that I will show you on examples of these cells. This is not the one from the book is actually not that great, but I will show you other pictures that give you a better idea of what stratified squamous epithelium looks like. All right, so those stratified squamous epithelium that lines the exterior surfaces usually has a protein called keratin. That's what I was talking about in terms of keratinization of your skin cells. So that protein keratin is what provide water resistance so that our skin does not need to be slimy and lined with mucus like a frog or a slug. This is what I was talking about, how we don't need to be walking around like a slime man because our surfaces of our skin is made up of skin cells or epithelial cells that have went through the process of keratinization. I'll talk about that process in detail in chapter 5, integumentary system. Now, those that line our interior surfaces, like the oral cavity, throat, esophagus, anus, and vagina, are non-keratinized, meaning that they do not have that that ability to resist sort of not be mucousy. Okay, they have to be hydrated all the time. So this is why those particular surfaces need to be continuously have that secretion of mucus to keep them moist and not dry out. Okay, so it keeps them from drying out. Okay, if they do dry out, they will deteriorate. So that's why though these areas will be need mucus cells, that we'll talk about what those are in a bit, because they are non-keratinized. Okay, so these are the more specific pictures that you can see the stratified squamous epithelium. So for example, these two pictures are both of the esophagus. This is the esophagus as well. It's just that this is more of a zoom out view. This is more of a zoom in view. Okay, so zoom out view farther away and you can see the esophagus as a bigger tube. If you take a cross section across your esophagus, this is that opening of the esophagus right here. Okay, so this is the whole thing as the esophagus right here, and this is the opening where food will move through, and these right here is that stratified squamous epithelium I was talking about. You see how there are many layers of flat-like scale-like tissues and cells that are stacked on top of each other one after another. So either in this view or this view, you have tons of layers of cells that you're seeing to show you what stratified squamous epithelium is like. Okay, and this is in the case of the vagina. And again, you will see that same stratified squamous epithelium. Those dots represent the nuclei of the epithelial cells, and you see many of these epithelial cells line up against each other. Okay. You don't have to identify blood vessels or lamina propria, okay? Just know that this is the stratified squamous epithelium. If it's a picture like this, it will be the esophagus. If it has curvatures, big curvatures like that, that will be your vagina, okay? All right, so moving on to the next specific kind of epithelial tissue, the simple cuboidal epithelium, which are one layer of box-shaped cells. Simple, one layer, cuboidal, box-shaped stuff, okay? So again, since they are only one layer thick, they can only provide limited amount of protection, but they are better than simple squamous at least because they're a little thicker, but they tend to be around areas where secretion and absorption is taking place slowly. Now, this is not where we need fast gas exchange, so we don't need that squamous epithelium, but this is where we need time, okay? We need time to absorb a lot of things like water, ions, nutrients, etc. So, like the kidney tubules called the nephrons. Okay, I'm going to write that word here, nephron. So kidney tubules are called nephrons, will have the simple cuboidal epithelium. So this is how a kidney looks like, and within there are a gazillion of these nephrons within it. And if we take a cross section of that particular kidney tubule, you will see that they are made up of that simple layer of simple cuboidal epithelium. Or the thyroid gland also has simple cuboidal epithelium. I'll show you that in a bit, in another slide. But here's a good picture of histology picture, because your book always shows you these beautiful two picture perfect microscopic views of tissues. But a lot of times when we Google a lot of these histology pictures, they're not as perfect and you can't tell what's what. And that's what's hard about the tissue lab, is because there are so many tissues you have to look at, identify, and at least, for online purposes, it's easier because I'd show you where things are. But, in person, what's hard about the tissue chapter is that sometimes you have to look all over the place for the tissue that you're looking for. So in this case, this is still showing the kidney, but it has this huge structure that is not a nephron. This is actually called the glomerulus, that you will learn about in the next chapter. And around the glomerulus is not simple cuboidal epithelium. It's actually simple squamous epithelium that surrounds that glomerulus, which is equivalent to this structure right here. Okay, that structure right there is equivalent to this. So this is not the area where we have simple squamous epithelium. These are the areas where we have simple cuboidal epithelium. So these are those kidney tubules I was talking about, all of these. Okay, you see how it has these square-like shaped cells all around the epithelium of those tubules, whereas those that surround the glomerulus, they are a lot flatter. Okay, so you see this flat cell right there, for example. Okay, so make sure you don't misidentify what part of the histology picture you're looking at. Okay. So stratified cuboidal epithelium is when you have multiple layers of those box-like cells. Okay, so stratified, many layers, cuboidal, box shape. These are usually rare in the body, just like simple cuboidal cells, they also function as secretion and absorption along with some protection. Okay, so secretion and some protection for the stratified cuboidal epithelia. There's only a few places where we have this type of epithelium, like ducts of sweat glands and mammary glands. And in this particular example, these are sweat gland ducts. Okay. So here's a sweat gland underneath our skin, and they're taking a cross section right there, and that's what we will see within the microscope slide of a sweat gland of that particular section. Now, these are other representation of other glands, such as your mammary glands. Okay, so mammary glands, this is a zoom out view of mammary glands. This is the stratified cuboidal epithelium that makes up the mammary gland, and inside here is the milk. If we zoom in to the mammary gland, we'll see that it is indeed, because here you're like, oh, I don't know if that's really 2 layers or 1 layer. But if you zoom in, you will see that there are 2 layers of cube-looking cells all along the mammary gland. Okay? Now, there are 2 in-between special kinds of epithelial tissues that we will mention. The first is called transitional epithelia. The word speaks for itself in what it does. It transitions between squamous and cuboidal shapes. Okay, so between these 2 shapes, it changes depending on the state of the organ. This allows for the flexibility in an organ that can go through repeated cycles of stretching without damaging the tissues. Again, there's not a lot of places in the body that has this type of epithelium. Transitional epithelium is usually in the urinary bladder, renal pelvis, and ureters. Everything that has to do with the urinary system kind of has this transitional epithelium. So this is, for example, the bladder. This right here is actually, you have your kidney, and then there's these tubes that goes down to the bladder. Okay. So this here is the bladder. This here is the ureter. And something right here, it kind of shapes like a funnel within the kidney to collect urine, is the renal pelvis. Again, you'll know these parts in the next chapter when we talk, next semester when we talk about the urinary system, but this is got a good glimpse of it. So when the bladder is empty, its epithelial cells will appear more plumpy, like cuboidal cells right here. So you see this plumpy, I like to call it plumpy because it looks plumpy on the microscope. Okay, and you'll see a lot of these cube-like structures of cells that resembles more of cuboidal epithelial cells. But when the bladder is full, its epithelial cells, especially the more top layers of that epithelium, will appear more flat, like squamous cells. Okay, flat like squamous cells, to accommodate for the pressure the amount of urine is exerting on the bladder, because your bladder is now filled with fluid all over the place. So it's pushing against those epithelium lining of the bladder, and that's why they will appear more flat and stretched versus plumpy like in an empty bladder. Again, this is another representation that is not as picture perfect like those in your book from the internet, where you have your plumpy cells, okay, serving as your empty bladder because there's no fluid that will be pushing against this epithelial tissue. And with a distended or full bladder, then you have these squamous like cells, especially that top layer right there, because the urine fluid is pushing pressure against and smushing your epithelial layer in a sense. Okay. All right, so then moving on to simple columnar epithelium. So this is when you have a single layer of tall rectangular cells like this, just one layer of them. These are usually in location where there are lots of secretions and absorption, wherever those happen. And again, this is usually a slow progress, okay? And it needs to be slow to maximize the amount of secretion and absorption involved, like your digestive tract. And their columnar shape, as means of protecting against chemical stress. So this is why the cells itself is so thick, is because there's probably some chemical stress involved within that organ, and that's why you can't have simple squamous epithelium in these particular tissues. So these are usually the simple columnar epithelium is usually found in linings of the stomach, your small and large intestines, or even the gallbladder and other stuff. But mainly, I want you to remember stomach and intestine, okay? Because those are areas where we have chemical stress. For example, your stomach acid coming from your stomach cells, and then you have feces within the large intestine that can harbor pathogens and bacteria and stuff like that. So that's why those areas will have a thicker type of epithelial cells, like simple columnar. Now, this is an example of the small intestine cells specifically, where we have microvilli. Remember, microvilli are in areas where we have lots of absorption going on. So you would see that in this drawing right here. But on the microscope, you actually have a hard time locating the microvilli. As you can see, it's just a layer of really mushy stuff all on top. You can't tell individual microvilli with the power of our light microscope, but you can see cilia. So that's how we can tell the difference between ciliated epithelium versus just epithelium that has microvilli. Microvilli, you can't tell. There's little lines on there, but cilia you can, okay? Microvilli are just too small and too close and densely packed together for us to see individual little finger-like structures. So this is an example from your stomach. Okay, example histology pictures, and that's why you see all these columnar cells along that forms that lining of the stomach that goes around, okay? All right, so here's the other in-between special kind of epithelium I was talking about earlier. So the other one was transitional epithelium within the bladder. This one is called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. This is due to the fact that its appearance looks as if they have multiple layers of cells, but they are in fact a single layer of cells that every cell have some kind of contact with the basement membrane. Even though it doesn't really look like that here, it doesn't appear that way, but it is in reality in contact with the basement membrane. So if I were to give a sort of pictorial drawing of this, so maybe something that looks like that, some cells that looks like that, some cells that looks like that, some cells that looks like that. So every one of those cells are in contact with that basement membrane, but they're just not all columnar looking. Some looks squamous, some looks cuboidal, okay? So that's why we call it pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, these tend to vary in shapes, like I was saying. Most of them appear, but most of them do appear like tall rectangular cells, and that's why we call them columnar epithelium. In addition, the epithelium oftentimes have cilia at the apical side of the cells because they're located in areas where some fluid or mucus movement is involved. So examples in the body where we have this type of pseudostratified columnar epithelium are those that line your nasal cavity, trachea, your bronchi, which is these regions right here, and parts of the male reproductive system tract as well. So this is the trachea, these are your bronchi, and those alveoli I was talking about earlier are at the ends of those little branches. So that's what I was saying, even with within the same organ, you can have different types of epithelial tissues for different purposes. So here is what I was talking about. You can see those cilia lining. You see those little hair looking things? Those are the cilia lining on top of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So that's another good way to remember or identify cells as pseudostratified columnar epithelium is if you can see little hairs on it. Because all the other cell types don't have cilia on it. Not the ones we show you anyway. There can be exceptions in other organs and areas of the body, but the ones we show you, the tissues that you have to know, this is the only type that have cilia on it. All right, so that's what I was talking about, where they line at. And this is another good example of what the trachea epithelial cells look like. Now you have a better view of these so-called columnar cells, but you also have smooshy cells like this. And then there's these interesting clear looking cells like these. These are called goblet cells. So make sure you remember what goblet cells are. Goblet cells are what secretes mucus along this pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Our airway needs to be lubricated in order to do its function. Your cilia needs to sweep some fluid along, some mucus along. Okay, if it's dry, then we can't get rid of dust particles or pollen particles as easily. So that's why your trachea has a lot of these goblet cells right here for secretion of mucus. And then the other area where you have pseudostratified columnar epithelium without the goblet cells is, for example, seminal vesicle, which is a gland, an accessory gland within the male reproductive system for secretion of the fluid that surrounds your sperm cells, okay, the semen, okay. So the semen, the majority of the volume of semen is made from seminal vesicles within the male reproductive system. But you can see how it looks like simple columnar, but you see these tiny little cells underneath here, these here as well. So that's why it's pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And lastly, for the epithelial cells, we have glandular epithelia, which are those that mix up your secretory glands. There are two main types of glands, endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are those that produce hormones and release them into the bloodstream directly. There are no duct, okay? That's the key word there for endocrine glands, is that they don't have ducts that connect the gland to the circulatory system. They just release the hormone and the hormone diffuse through into the circulatory system. Some examples are your thyroid gland, thymus, okay, and pituitary gland. And this is a picture of, for example, the thyroid gland. And here's those simple cuboidal epithelium I was talking about earlier when I was talking about simple cuboidal epithelium. Thymus is another gland within that sits on top of your heart at the apical side of your heart, and they are for T cell maturation. Pituitary gland we'll talk about immensely in the next semester for endocrine system. The other type of glands, like I was saying, it's called exocrine glands, which are those that release secretions onto surfaces or into the blood, your circulatory system, with a duct of some sort. So that's the main difference between endocrine and exocrine gland. Endocrine glands are ductless. Exocrine glands have ducts in them. Okay, so for example, sweat glands in our skin have ducts that arrives at the external surfaces of the skin, like the picture we've seen when I was talking about stratified cuboidal epithelium. So here's your section of our skin. Here's some hair that sticks out of your skins, and a lot of time you see this duct and then some curvature of coils of tubes. So this can be a sweat gland, and then you see that there is a duct here that releases sweat onto the surface of your integumentary system, skin cells. Okay, so there's a duct that leads from the gland onto the surface. Okay, tears through tear ducts, okay, also is another good example of exocrine glands. So they're called lacrimal ducts. We'll talk about these in the last chapter of this semester, in chapter 17. Milk also releases from mammary glands through lactiferous, okay, ducts through, before excreting around the nipple area. So all of these exocrine glands have some kind of ducts, and they're named with different names, of course. But they have ducts that lead to their destination, okay? So the difference between endocrine and exocrine cells is most obvious in the pancreas. The pancreas is a special organ where it has both endocrine and exocrine functions. Endocrine function is performed by pancreatic islets for production of insulin and glucagon, for example, to regulate blood glucose, and they have no ducts connected to them. The hormones just gets released directly into the bloodstream. On the other hand, there's another type of cells in the pancreas called acinar cells that perform exocrine function, where they produce digestive enzymes released into the intestine to help with the digestive process. So these digestive enzymes have to go through a duct called the pancreatic duct, and there's a duct that leads to the secretion to their destination in the small intestine. So if I were to draw this out, usually the pancreas is kind of shaped like this, like a little fish. And then you see that there's a central duct, okay? And all of these are divided into lobules, what we call. So there are specific areas within the pancreas where it is for endocrine function, which is insulin and glucagon. And these hormones just travels out into the bloodstream. Usually there's a blood vessel nearby where they can travel into the bloodstream and into the circulatory system and go to their destinations for regulating blood glucose. Now, there are areas within the pancreas that is called acinar cells. And those release, for example, I'm just going to call it digestive enzymes for now. But there's proteases, that is for digesting proteins, nucleases for digesting nucleic acid. But just know them as digestive enzymes for now. You don't need to know the specifics. And they will get released into this pancreatic duct right there. This whole thing is the pancreatic duct. And then it goes into your small intestines. okay, small intestines, and release into the small intestine for digestion of the food that you eat coming through your digestive tract. Okay, so this is for endocrine function. As in our cells is for exocrine function. One has ducts, okay, and one doesn't involve ducts, okay? All right. I think that's all for epithelial cells, and now is a good time for a break because 1 hour is up. So I'll give you a break here for part 1 of chapter 4. Don't be surprised if I have to divide this chapter into 3 parts because of its length, okay? So I will come back in part 2 to talk about connective tissue.